I would like to start with my presentation. I would like to introduce myself. My name is Hasselmann. I'm a PhD student at the University of Bâle. So, welcome everyone to my presentation called Hot on the Trails of the Events, the Collectors of the Red Army Museum at the Front of the Great Patriotic War. During the Great Patriotic War, as the Russians till today call the Second World War, the employees of the Red Army Museum followed the Soviet troops closely to collect objects for future exhibitions from the newly liberated areas. Based on the so-called expeditions to the front, the question of circulation and transformation of museums' collection in the case of the Soviet Union during the Second World War, posed by this Journée d'études, can be answered. Central to my 20 minutes presentation is the question of collecting practices used during that period. Who was sent to the front? Which objects should and could be collected? Was there a collaboration between the people from the museum, the Red Army soldiers, and political state structures? How were the remnants of the war transformed into objects of memory for exhibitions? And can this process, which I call museification, be reconstructed? The answers to these questions illustrate the changes in the Soviet museum's work in the context of war and make a contribution to the research of Stalinist culture during the Second World War. The Central Museum of the Red Army was a department of the so-called Central House of the Red Army in Moscow, which you can see here. After the war broke out in June 1941, the museum's collections and the majority of its staff were evacuated to Kazan, a city approximately 800 kilometers east of Moscow. This happened upon the order of the People Commissariat for Education, the Nachkomprost, which the museum was subordinated to. Another order concerning the working methods of the museum in wartime conditions compelled all museums to completely dedicate their work to patriotic and military education. The Red Army Museum in Moscow tried to follow these instructions in three ways. Besides the protection and evacuation of their collections and the continuing exhibition work, the quest for exhibits at the front and in the rear was an important component of their work during the war. It seems that in the early phase of the war, the museum acquired mainly German weapons. The sources in the archive report proudly that already at the end of July 1941, the first shot-down German airplane entered into the possession of the museum. This exhibition photo was titled Down Fascist Vulture, which is en français charognard, to give you an impression of the atmosphere in this exhibition. This title probably coincided with the objects panel. The first collectors at the front, however, were not employees of the museum, but political commissars, polit rukovoditelь, from the military political Lenin Academy in Moscow. Already on 24th December 1941, the first 6 political commissars, accompanied by 6 lieutenant colonels, were dispatched to the front by the director of the House of the Red Army, with the order to collect trophies for the exhibition Destruction of the German Invaders on the Way to Moscow. They were sent in pairs to different army units. The few employees who remained in Moscow under the supervision of the museum's directors Colonel Vladimir Ivanovich Vityany cleaned the newly arriving German military equipment, removing snow, dirt and ice, and then every employee received a tutorial on the firing range of the director, how to take the weapons apart, reassemble and use them. German prisoners explained the special features of the German weapons. This knowledge about the enemy's equipment was later used to prepare their own espionage units for their missions in the German hinterland. The work schedules from the museum's archive show that the collecting activities around Moscow after the victorious counter-offensive in Moscow and the internal treatment with the arriving objects became increasingly systematic in spring 42. Some employees received clearly defined research projects, for example, finding visual material that illustrate partisan struggle or cataloging the German weapons. Here, the question of responsibility and ownership or property arises. Who was entitled to which remnants of the war? The Red Army soldiers, who encountered an unknown level of wealth on their march west, or the army, who needed resources for their propaganda, or the state and its investigative bodies, needing proof for the atrocious crimes inflicted on the Soviet people by the Germans, or the museum, that needed objects for exhibition and the resulting mental mobilization of the people. In the Russian literature, there's only very general mentions of various bureaucratic barriers which had to be overcome when acquiring an object. The sources, on the other hand, provide information about the conflicts of ownership indirectly. There are numerous requests and inquiries recorded which were sent to the military units, partisan groups, and local party offices with a request of cooperation and provision of certain objects. In the following letter, which you can see on the slide, the director of the museum asked the local party committee for direct support for his employee who was on a collecting mission. On the 10th of November 42, the director of the museum, Fedjani, wrote, "The Central Museum of the Red Army asks you to provide museum's guide, Comrade Leonova, with materials characterizing the labor heroism of the Moscow people in October-November 41 in building defensive constructions and organizing the workers' brigades, workers' battalion, and so on, as well as the help of the Moscow people in the battle with the Germans in 42, essential for the display in the exhibition Destruction of the German Invaders on the way to Moscow." We can see that these requests were clearly formulated. There was an unambitious collection profile. But what did these so-called expeditions to the front look in practice? What were the employees told? What sort of protection did they get on this business trip, which were at very high risk? Generally, the expeditions to the front were tasked with two things. Firstly, the search for the objects, and secondly, the building up of a simple touring exhibition. These so-called front exhibitions consisted of pop-up boards in DIN A4 format. These boards were put up in turf huts and other army barracks. The museum's workers would give presentations for the soldiers during ceasefires. Here you can see the young museum's guide, the only woman on the picture. You can see her. The museum's guide Maria Konstantinovna Nazarova, with the museum's director Fedjani on her left. In October 43, shortly before the director was killed on one of these missions, they visited a partisan group in the Bryansk area. Nazarova, who had already been on a trip to the front with an exhibition in April 42, remembered her first deployment as follows. "One time, I was moving a front exhibition together with a head of the political department and asked him, 'Where are you taking me?' And he taught me the following lesson. 'Devushka, don't ask this kind of question in the future.' No one had invited us, and no one was waiting for us. We had to find the way to our objects ourselves. Had anyone been sent to these units before? It was our duty to find the fighters that the newspapers had written about. In case they had already died, we had to find the weapons, document, and personal belongings. It was easier to find material that belonged to the enemy. There were many trophies and letters, but from our side, we collected pamphlets in the units which told the heroic stories of the soldiers, but obtaining weapons was difficult. Those who were alive didn't want to give theirs, also not the weapons and equipment they had inherited from the fallen heroes, as a remembrance of their friends. We managed with great difficulty to obtain the party cards and the Komsomol badges. as well as the military awards for the fallen soldiers. Essentially, everything was there, but the information was sparse and the photo camera wasn't working due to the cold. Talking to our soldiers was impossible because they were under attack. That's why the description of the objects we collected were very sparse. Soon we had enough material, but there was no transportation. The loading and reloading from one vehicle onto the other was always very difficult. Often the drivers were in a hurry and did not want to take the things with them. The collection of objects became much easier after the turning point of the war took effect in summer '43. And yes, we were more experienced. The museums commanded the trip, but it was the political general administration of the Red Army, the Glasburka, who signed the request. That's why they gave us the interesting material. Here we see Comrade Nazarova with the crew of a propeller-driven plane in January '43. Nazarova was supposed to fly with the objects collected at the front at Donetsk to the city of Saratov in the rear. Thus, the remnants of the war arrived in the museum's collections. There they were cleaned, labeled, and exhibited. How can this process of museification be described? Obviously, there was a process of change of ownership and a re-evaluation of the artifacts. The process of making the objects publicly visible in the context of a national museum can be described with the French term patrimonialisation, suggested by the organizers of this Journée d'études, described as a social-cultural process which transforms an item into an object which henceforward should be preserved and exhibited. Perhaps a Begriffsanalyse helps with the description of this process. The remnants that were collected at the front were called trophies from the beginning. This term stems from the Greek word tropaion and describes the practice of marking a place of victory with the destroyed weapons of the defeated. In a Soviet dictionary, which was published on the eve of the war, the Russian version trophy is defined as prey, which during a victory is being conquered from the enemy and serves as a sign and symbol of the victory. Orders marked the trophies as state property. They were characterized as something soldiers should collect and send to the next higher installation. In October '43, the Red Army Museum opened an exhibition on an unprecedented scale in Gorky Park, titled Examples of Trophy Weapons Captured from the Germans in '41 to '43. 34 airplanes, 48 tanks, and 189 cannons were exhibited. This display of trophies demonstrated that the Red Army was about to win the war, explained why there had been so many losses, and why the fortune of war had been on the side for the Germans for too long. These photos are stills of a documentary about the exhibition, which attracted over 1 million visitors. In his dissertation about the material culture of Red Army, Brendan Schechter from Berkeley shows that the term trophy was used for all sorts of things in the everyday life during the war. It describes not only everything that was foreign and formerly belonged to the enemy, but also all the useful things that were left behind on the battlefield, including Soviets' own destroyed war material. Until the foundation of the Trofejny Brigade in February '43, there was no Soviet state organization that regulated trophy collecting. This probably facilitated the collecting practices of the museum employees. However, they were heavily dependent on help from the army and the party structures, as well as on the help of the local civilians. In this drawing from a guy called Zagorsky, we see, for example, how the imperial eagle from the Berlin Reichskanzlei is being carted off by Red Army soldiers. In the records of the museum, one can find a written report about the entry of this object into the Moscow Museum collection. Here we see the Berlin Imperial Eagle in the most prominent room of the museum, demonstratively exhibited on the floor. the museum obtained an even more valuable object at the end of the war, the flag of victory, Znamia Pobedy, which was hoisted on the burning Reichstag and was later the holiest of holy war relics. To finish, I would like to pose the question if, and if yes, how the collection and the museum changed through the influence of war. I would argue that the war had the following impact on the Red Army Museum in Moscow. Thanks to its location, it was not destroyed by the German occupation like other museums. Despite its evacuation of its staff and collection, the museum employees managed to acquire roughly 99,000 new museum objects until the end of the war, mainly through their intense collection activities at the front and in the rear. Here, we can assume that the good relation of the museums with the central house of the Red Army and the military political institution was beneficial in this process. The museum's public presence as a trophy collector, not least through the huge exhibition in Gorky Park, led to the acquisition of the most valuable object. This state honor served as a basis for argumentation for a new and separate museum building, which would work as a state institution, independent from the culture house of the Red Army. On May 65, during the celebration of the 20th University of Victory Day, the museum opened its doors of the new building called Museum of the United Forces of the Soviet Union, and its new permanent exhibition about the Great Patriotic War. Merci beaucoup pour votre attention. Maintenant, je serai ravie de répondre à vos questions. I thank you for your attention. I'm very curious about your questions.